think of the New Jersey pines. I think most of us are familiar with that. I think probably everyone here has visited parts of the Pinelands probably many times. It's nearly 1 million acres in southeastern New Jersey, in the outer coastal plain. It's a place of great beauty, and also a place that is home to many rare and endangered plants and animals. Allison will be talking about the geology, biology, the ecology, and the human cultural history of the Pine Barrens. Allison, I know, has led kayak and paddleboarding tours in coastal salt marshes for over 10 years. She has a background in marine biology and in environmental education. She's a graduate of Stockton University's marine biology program and is a senior fellow in the Educational Leadership Program Fellowship. And so very happy to introduce Allison and the New Jersey Pine Barrens.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for having me here tonight. Tonight, as Rich said, we're going to be talking about the Pine Barrens in general, both the Pine Barrens and the Pinelands. I can see some Pinelands Preservation Alliance merch, so I'm guessing that all of you are going to be more well-versed in this topic than the groups I typically talk to. So we're going to get back to basics, talk about both Pine Barrens and Pinelands from the basics, and dive deep into some of these areas. Throughout this, you'll hear me refer to both the Pine Barrens and the Pinelands. Just to differentiate those two topics right from the very beginning. Pine Barrens is an ecological term used to describe these areas that have acidic, sandy soil with low nutrients, acidic water, that are very fire prone, and plants that are fire adapted. Then we also have the Pinelands, that is a political term, refers to the Pinelands National Reserve. And we'll talk a little bit about what exactly that entails. There's a couple different parts to my talk. I'll pause for questions at the end of each section. If we get to all the sections, wonderful. If we have lots of questions and we don't, then not the end of the world. So please don't hold back questions. But let's get started. All right, so background of the Pine Barrens. So what is the Pine Barrens? It's a wilderness area in the most densely populated state in the Union. There are a couple different definitions of wilderness area. The one that I like the best, and the one that I typically work with, is an area where you can stand for at least 15 minutes and not hear any evidence of human activity. So you can go a full 15 minutes without hearing a car, an airplane, another person talking, no sounds made by humans. It's the largest surviving open space on the eastern seaboard. It's a community of plants and animals that are found nowhere else in the world. It's a special place to explore. And it's also an ongoing story of the struggle between human exploitation and the preservation of nature. So, the Pine Barrens exist, there we go, entirely within the outer coastal plain here. So, this is a relatively young area compared to, if you look at the whole state of Jersey here, you can see the geologic times on the left side of that map there. And you can see that the areas that are in the outer coastal plain are the youngest of the ones listed. This list over here goes from the oldest sediments down here in the Precambrian that are placed all the way up to the youngest ones that were placed in the Cenozoic era. And if I overlay this green blotch here, this is the 1.1 million acre Pinelands National Preserve. So it exists entirely within that outer coastal plain there, entirely with that tertiary sand, silt, and clay that was laid down in the Cenozoic era. And one thing that's extremely unusual about the Pine Barrens is it's considered what we call a disjunct ecoregion. So we have this very large chunk of Pine Barrens here in New Jersey, and then the next closest Pine Barrens is up in Long Island. The next closest to that is up in Massachusetts and Cape Cod. So these areas don't actually connect. They're not touching each other, which is where the disjunct part comes in. These are similar types of areas. They're all defined by that acidic sandy soil that drains quickly, low nutrients, fire prone, all those things that I listed at the beginning. So they have similar plants and animals, not exactly the same ones in all three regions. And then there's other bits of pine barrens that you can find throughout North America. Those other spots that are listed on the right over there have other pine barrens communities. And yeah, again, the largest ones are the big chunk here in New Jersey, then that little stretch out there on Long Island, and those handful of areas up on Cape Cod. The land use of this area is also unusual. It's this big, big stretch of green, this green space in a sea of blue and red. So blue and red on this map are primarily the more built up areas and areas that have more ground coverage due to housing developments and suburban areas as opposed to the more rural and more open areas in the Pine Barrens there. And now we get to the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan. This is also the map that I have in front of me here, slightly different colors showing the same thing that I'll hang out here the whole time that I'm talking as something to refer back to. So the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan came about in the late 1970s and early 1980s when they created the Pinelands Protection Act. So the Pinelands Protection Act was brought in place following up a decade of people really realizing that ecology and green spaces were something that was important and something that should be protected here. So Rachel Carson's Silent Spring came out in the late 60s, and that really started an environmental revolution, as I'm sure all of you are already very aware. In New Jersey, it, along with John McPhee's book, The Pine Barrens, were some of the things that kickstarted our governor into start looking at the natural resources within New Jersey, and he wanted to start protecting those. The governor at the time, Brendan T. Byrne, looked at a lot of the things that were going on in Jersey, because how many of you were here in Jersey in the 70s, especially surrounding Atlantic City? What was something that was popping up then? Yeah, the casinos were starting, and people had really big plans for the casinos. So they wanted to make sure that some of these green spaces that were relatively close to areas that were suddenly going to be built up, and at the time they were hoping would become huge population centers, there was a concern that these green spaces adjacent to that would no longer be green for very long if left to their own devices. So the Pinelands Protection Act and the Comprehensive Management Plan really went hand in hand in order to define what could be built in this area that was now labeled as the Pinelands National Reserve. So this map here shows what they came up with. So we have these areas, like around here, these green areas that had traditionally been green areas, they kept green areas. So we have Morton State Forest, we have Bass River State Forest, Double Trouble, Parvin State Park, several parks that had been green for a very, very long time and would continue to be green into the foreseeable future. Now, it was difficult with this particular area because we had people who had settlements here for hundreds of years. So they couldn't necessarily come into a town that someone has lived in for 8 generations and say, we're taking your farm away because we want it to be a part of a state park now. People wouldn't support that plan. So they made this experiment, and what they decided to do was have specific areas that were designated as Pine Barrens villages, Pine Pine Barrens towns and rural areas. The most unusual thing they did was they came up with these areas that are orange on the map, that are the regional growth areas. Areas that were not heavily populated places at the time of this, but they expected those to be larger population centers in the coming decades. So they decided to leave these areas as areas where developers could move in and put new developments. Where they said these green places, you're not allowed in there, you can't put things in there, but you can have these orange areas and they're yours. The Pine Barrens villages and Pine Barrens towns that I mentioned, for example, some of the better known ones, we have Hamilton right here, we have Chatsworth up here. The purple are the towns, red are the villages, and the biggest difference between those is population density. So the towns, going along with the zoning boards of each individual municipality, they came in and said, you're allowed to have this many people per square mile in this town. In the villages, you're allowed to have this many people per square mile, and it's fewer. So if you drive down Main Street of Hamilton today, you'll see it's a cute small town. There's lots of people there. If you drive through Tabernacle or Chatsworth, they're both cute small towns too, but there's much fewer people there. You'll see a lot more agriculture, a lot more farmlands in those towns. Anybody have questions about this before I move on?
When they build homes, did they designate so many acres per house or something?
That was up to each individual municipality after it was designated the population center, if it was a village or a town or a regional growth area.
What are the white stripes?
So those areas along the coast there are ones that are within the Pinelands National Reserve, but they are outside the state designated Pinelands area. So kind of a gray area that's covered in that 1.1 million acres, but not in the state designated. Alright, so this Pinelands and the Pinelands National Reserve is an excellent example of regional planning. It combines human land reuse with natural resource protection. It's really a balancing act, as opposed to the previous Yellowstone model, where basically the idea was they would come in, say this is now nationally protected land, and people can stay out. People are allowed in to visit and to stay temporarily, but people can't live here. The idea behind this balancing act is the sustainability of it. The idea is that we can use some of the resources here, but it won't deplete the resources for the future. This does extend to the biodiversity as well, but the idea was that that balance would be maintained. People could still live here, we could still have economic opportunities, but we weren't going to continue to deplete and diminish the natural resources that are available here. So let's move on to the physical influences that helped create the Pine Barrens as we know them. So there's four major factors that helped create the Pine Barrens. The first one that is the largest influence was the glaciation that helped to create this area, helped to carve it out. This led to us having our sandy soil, also led to the large reserves of water we have here and the unusual properties of our water. And finally, there's fire. Very, very fire-prone area. So, glaciation. All starts with the Pleistocene glaciation. So, around this time, temperatures dropped about 2 million years ago. Let me just get all the info up here first. There we go. So during this time, the polar ice started making its way down to the equator. The Earth got much, much colder. The largest glacier reached south to Middlesex County, so almost 10 miles away from the northern edge of the Pine Barrens. Very, very close. Now, this did not disappear from New Jersey entirely until around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. Speaking of the geologic time frame, this is really recent. means that many of the plants and most of the evolution that we're seeing here now has only happened within about the last 10,000 years. Again, that's an absurdly short amount of time when we're talking on a global scale. Now, up in North Jersey and more western Jersey, the glacier did cover this part of the state. So when the glacier would form and recede, it would scrape this part of the state. This scraping action exposed bedrock. It moved the gravel and the sands that had been on the land there, and it carved out these deeper valleys and lakes. There are no natural lakes in the Pine Barrens, so they have all been dammed up either by animals, by beavers, or by humans, but the lakes are not natural here. As opposed to up in northern western Jersey, there are natural lakes there, and many of them have been formed by glacier activity during this time. So while the southern and eastern part of New Jersey was not covered by a glacier, it was considered tundra. So the weather in this area was more similar to modern-day Labrador than it is today. Also, many of the plants that were here were tundra plants as well. So what came from this? Pine Barrens was very cold. It also means that melting glacial ice, as those glaciers formed and receded, flowed over the Pine Barrens. It took that sediment that was scraped away from North and West Jersey and deposited it in the southern and eastern part of the state, leaving this sand and gravel in its wake. It also means that many of the northern plant species were brought down by that glacial ice and landed here. We're able to take root in this tundra and stay there. So after that glaciation, it led to us having very sandy soil here in the Pine Barrens. So if you look at the soil composition here, we're about 85 to 90% quartz sand here, which is very similar to the composition of what you would find on a beach, which is extremely unusual for a forest. Typically, when you walk through a forest, you expect to see that very rich, dark soil that's typical of most northeastern forests. Here in the Pine Barrens, that's not what you'll find at all. You're more likely to find something that looks better suited for building sand castles than for growing any type of forest plants. Going along with this, the soil is extremely acidic. That quartz that exists in our sand has a natural pH level. Now, if we're looking at the pH scale, with 7 being neutral, our soil has a natural range going from about 5.5 down to about 3.5. To give you an idea, at the low end, that's about the pH that orange juice is. So extremely acidic. This makes a big difference on the types of plants that are able to survive here in the Pine Barrens. Also, the sandy soil is very high drainage. So think of if it rains and you look at a beach. The water doesn't pool on the surface of the sand. It gets sucked in very quickly, trickles its way through to the aquifer, that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But that sandy soil doesn't hold the water at its surface. This high drainage means that it also brings the nutrients through with it. As the water trickles through, it carries the nutrients down through the soil. The sandy particles are quite large, so the water can make its way through the sand. Okay. So, let's talk about that glacier one more time. So, I have a map here of the furthest extent of the glaciation and where the coastline was when the glacier was as far south as it could possibly be. That's this blue line over here. So on the top, that shows you where the glacier extended, it's furthest south. And the coastline was all the way out here, this other blue line towards the ocean. On the opposite end of that, we have this red line that shows you when the glacier was as melted as it would be during this time period. The sea levels came as far inland as that red line. So you can see there's a very drastic layer there to show just how much of the state of New Jersey was either underwater. The Pine Barrens was entirely underwater when that glacier was as far receded as it would be during that time period. On the opposite end of things, you can see where that glacier came down quite far, and the Pine Barrens was pretty far inland when the glaciers were fully formed. And those were the time periods when that sediment was being blown off of the areas that were under the glacier, and the glacial melt as it went between those two stages brought that sediment down and laid it down on the Pine Barrens. So that leads us to our soils here. So in the Pine Barrens, as I mentioned, we're about 85 to 90% quartz, lots of iron and aluminum as well. And because of the low organic material that we have here in our soils, it's that very, very high drainage that I mentioned. When things decompose, they do not stay in our soil to add nutrients in there. It washes through quickly. It means that our soils are quite dry. Also means that we have very low nutrient levels. And the acidity there. So if we have our pH scale here with bleach up at 13 and gastric acid down at 1, the Pine Barrens soils and therefore the water ends up, I'm sorry, I thought there was a circle that ends up there, in this range here, between just above black coffee to just above orange juice, so in that range there, quite acidic. Now, all of these properties in the soil directly lead to properties in our water. So the water here, because it's going through the soil very quickly, ends up in aquifers. I'm sure all of you know the aquifer that we're sitting on top of here. We're on the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer. Now, this is 17 trillion gallons of water. This is a mind-bogglingly large number. To give you an idea just how much water that is, if you took the entire state of New Jersey and sunk it 10 feet in water, that would be approximately 17 trillion gallons. That's what's under our feet right here, right now. And this is where the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer is. So it covers almost a third of the state of New Jersey. We have the green line of the Pinelands National Reserve overlaid on this map as well. So you can see that the vast majority of the aquifer is under the Pinelands Reserve. Was that a question?
Is there significance to the name of the aquifer?
You know, I'm not sure. I believe it was the people who originally found the aquifers who they were named after, but I'd have to double check that. So this water leads us to having 3 main types of habitats in the Pine Barrens. We have our uplands, our lowlands, and our wetlands. Now the uplands have dry soil, that dry, light, sandy beach sand. The lowlands have more moist soil, occasionally wet, occasionally dry, depending on different factors at that particular moment. And then we have our wetlands that are continuously saturated, except in times of droughts. Our water is quite unusual. We have cedar water, so it's often called iced tea water because it's this brownish, reddish color. Now, many newcomers to the area see that brown water and think, oh, it must be terribly polluted. Quite the opposite. This is some of the cleanest water that you'll encounter certainly on the eastern seaboard and probably across the entire country. It is quite acidic, and that tea color comes from the high iron content that adds the reddishness in there. But there's also tannins that are leached out of our vegetation. that acidity of the water helps to pull those tannins out. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have experienced tannins in the past. If you've ever drank a really dry red wine, or you've had a really good black tea, and it feels like all the moisture has been sucked out of your mouth, that's tannins. That's also present in our cedar trees and in the pine needles. So as this vegetation finds its way into the water, the acidity leaches that out and makes the water this brownish reddish color. So for our areas here, we have these different types of habitats that you'll find across the Pine Barrens. We have our cedar swamps, hardwood swamps, pine hardwood lowlands, pitch pine lowlands, and pine oak uplands. So what this graph is showing is the depth to the water in these different habitats. The likelihood of this habitat occurring when the aquifer or the depth to the water is at different levels. So to give you an idea, if it is more than about 120 centimeters to get to the water, you can almost guarantee that it's going to be pine oak uplands. On the opposite end of things, if the water is pretty much right there within the first couple of centimeters, you're probably going to be either in a hardwood swamp or even more likely a cedar swamp. So how close that water is under your feet helps to determine what plants are growing in that particular area, what the chances of it are. And finally, we have fire. This is one of the most defining characteristics and one of the most unusual things about the Pine Barrens. Fires are frequent. We have very dry soil. The vegetation is highly flammable. There's lots of natural oils in cedar trees, pine trees, and that helps make them more flammable. So this means that when something like lightning comes through the Pine Barrens, it's more likely to ignite and start a full forest fire than in some other areas where if it hits, it might smolder and go out. But this means the Pine Barrens ecology is actually dependent upon these frequent fires. The plants have adapted to not only thrive in fires, but really need them in order to maintain the balance that they have. When there aren't fires, when the fires are suppressed, it shifts the makeup of the forest communities. So the oak trees will over time outcompete the pine trees if fires are not there to hit that reset button. So if we go long enough without fires, we will eventually have oak barrens and not pine barrens. And this fire is one of the few ways that nutrients make their way into this soil. As I've mentioned a couple of times, nutrients don't like to hang out in very porous, well-draining soil. So that fire helps to add a layer of nutrients on top of the forest soil there. It stays a little bit longer than most other nutrients that would end up there. So on the left here, I have different types of habitats. The ones with asterisks are the ones that are found in the Pine Barrens. On the right are the intervals in which fire will typically return in these habitats. Also, that's the interval in which a fire may be necessary, especially for the more frequent ones. So, at least for the ones that are frequently in the Pine Barrens, we have our oak pine forest. So that means there are more oak trees than there are pine trees. They were very simplistic with the naming process here. If there's more pine trees than oak trees, then it's pine oak. So for oak pine forest, that's the habitat that has the least frequent fires in the Pine Barrens. So every 60 to 100 years is necessary for that to be maintained as an oak pine forest. If we don't have it within that range, then it will be exclusively an oak forest and no longer considered a Pine Barrens habitat. A little bit more frequently, when the oaks are suppressed by that fire, we start to get that pine oak forest, all the way down to our dwarf pine plains. Now, that's an area that is extremely unusual. There's only a handful of those in the world. Even the other pine barrens habitats that I talked about earlier, I only know of one other area that has dwarf pine plains. And that requires fire every 5 to 15 years, extremely frequently. And these plants that are in the pine barrens are adapted for these frequent fires. For example, the dwarf pitch pine trees that are found in that dwarf pine forest. The pitch pine trees have an adaptation. They have a special kind of pine cone called a serotinous pine cone. This is a pine cone that requires fire to open. It's sealed with a waxy substance on the inside, and when it's hit with the high heat of a forest fire, the pine cone will pop open, seeds fly out. The idea is that the seeds will catch the updraft from a forest fire, float around, and find an area with soil that has been cleared by the fire. Most pitch pine trees that are either in oak pine, pine oak, or pine oak woodlands have anywhere from about 5 to 25% of their pine cones will be serotinous. In the dwarf pine plains, it can be up to 80% of their pine cones will be serotinous, meaning that they require fire to open. So the plants that are in these different areas are used to these frequent fires and again require them in order to reproduce. So we have several different, yes?
Isn't the dwarf pine going to grow so tall?
Exactly. So it's the same pitch pine trees you'll find elsewhere in the forest, but they put all their nutrients into growing those pine cones. So they will only stand about 4.5 feet tall. Most people can stand in the dwarf pine forest and look straight over the canopy. It's a crazy experience if you haven't been there. It's very cool. So the different fire sheds we have here, I'm sure all of us are familiar with watersheds. Similarly, we have fire sheds, areas in the pine barrens and the surrounding areas that have specific things checked off, and they're mostly grouped together. So in West Jersey, right over here, we have area that has been mostly cleared for farmland. Fire is very frequently suppressed in this area, so the forests are mostly hardwood, oak, hickory. The soil is a little bit more moist, more silty, so it does hold on to a little bit more moisture than the true pine barren sand you'll find elsewhere. There are much less frequent fires here. Going to B, which are our coastal areas. That's going to be oak pine and oak hickory. There's large streams and lots of floodplains, so again, the soil is a little bit more moist and we're not going to be getting nearly as many fires. Moving on to C, this is really like the heart of our pine barrens there. That's going to be an oak pine forest primarily, moist soils, a little bit more clay, and that's going to have slightly fewer fires, slightly more than the areas we have been talking about, but fewer than some of the other ones. Finally, we're moving up to this area here, D. And that's going to be a mix of pine oak and oak pine. So we have the pitch pine lowlands and cedar swamps. The uplands are going to be sandy and drier, so more moderate fire level. Finally, we have our, up in this area, E, and this is also where the dwarf pines will be found. This is the most frequent fire area. This area is also the most dependent on frequent fires. Any questions about this before I move on to the next bit? So all of these factors come together to create this mosaic of very drastically different communities. We have our uplands, we have our lowlands, and we have our aquatic areas. I'm sure all of you can read, so I won't list them all off for you. But before we move on to our next section, does anybody have questions about any of those 4 factors that help to shape the pine barrens as we know them?
The mighty red oak, redwood trees need a fire to grow.
They were need fire as well? Oh, I didn't know that. Very cool. Anything else? So let's move on to some more of those plant adaptations. So one of the problems that the plants in the pine barrens face are those low nutrients. So this means that the plants have to conserve the use of nutrients. The adaptations that the plants have come up with, we have many conifers, many evergreen trees. So by not losing their leaves every year, they're conserving those nutrients, holding on to them, meaning they don't need to expend the energy to grow more leaves every season. They lose a few needles here and there, and they can easily regrow those with the nutrients they have available at any particular time. We also have carnivorous plants. These are some of my favorites. Especially this time of year, it's spooky, they're weird. We have 3 different classes of them. We have pitcher plants, sundews, and bladderworts. The pitcher plants are some of the most dramatic ones. They're these ones on the left here. So they fill up with rainwater, and the plant will turn that water almost into a digestive enzyme. They have these little hairs sticking down inside of the plant. So insects, small frogs, very small rodents will find their way inside those pitcher plants, and the plant will slowly digest them. Whatever's in that plant can't climb back up because of those hairs sticking down inside. The sundews have sticky dew on the end of each of those fronds right here. And an insect will get stuck in that dew, and the plant will digest it as it's stuck there. Finally, the bladderworts are the fastest hunting plants on the planet. They have this little hairpin trigger that floats in the water in front of this vacuole. When something hits the vacuole, it will suck in whatever hit it. And it happens in a fraction of an eye blink. To give you an idea, if we had a mammal that hunted as quickly as the bladderwort does, it would be the equivalent of a cheetah that could run 2 million miles an hour. And these are a few more of the sundews. One of the other interesting adaptations that a sundew has, they have their flowering body all the way up here on this stalk, quite far away from their leaves that hunt. They want to make sure that they don't eat their pollinators accidentally. And a couple of close-ups of the sundews. You can get a better idea of what that looks like when there's actually an insect stuck in that sticky dew. Now these are slightly misleading photos. The sundews are very, very small. Most photography you see of it will be macro photography. I know the first time I saw one in person, I was shocked how tiny they were. And finally, our bladderworts here. So this is magnified many, many, many times over. But you can see that trigger hanging out over here. So in the animation here, if one of these larval insects floating around in the water column hits that trigger, it will be sucked into that vacuole by a vacuum that it creates. The next problem that many plants in the pine barrens need to face are dry soils. We all know plants need water. If the soil isn't providing it, they need to figure out another way in order to survive with minimal water. So pine needles are very thick and tough. Pine needles are leaves. Most people don't really make that connection looking at a needle. Because they're tough and waxy and they have that small reduced surface area, there's limited evaporation that can happen from these modified leaves. Helps the plant to hold on to water while it's in the pine barrens. Oak leaves and one of the other types of plants that you'll find very commonly, they're in the heath family. They also have rather thick leaves that help them to retain moisture well. Heath plants especially will have relatively small leaves for their size, which again helps to limit that evaporation from leaves. Next we have the acidic soils. Now, the acidic soil can leach those nutrients out of plants and helps make it difficult for the nutrients to stay in the soil there. So again, because of how acidic the soil is, it's in this range here, you can see that that means that most nutrients cannot stay in this acidic soil, barring one that does a really good job hanging out there, iron. Again, some of the other adaptations that the plants have, the low leaf surface area, the waxy leaves, leaning on the carnivorous strategy, helps the plants to either get their nutrients from other sources or to hold on to the nutrients that they already have. And then when it comes to fire, obviously that's going to be something that is difficult for plants to deal with. We already talked about the serotinous pine cones for the pitch pine trees. Pitch pine trees also have this extremely thick, scaly bark. On large pitch pine trees, it can be almost 2 inches thick of bark before you get to the heartwood of the tree. So the idea is that thick bark will burn, and as long as the heartwood does not burn, the tree will survive. The tree will produce something called epicormic shoots, which are these pine needles growing directly out of the trunk of the tree. This allows the tree to photosynthesize and start getting nutrients from the sun without needing to expend the energy to grow an entire new branch. Shrub oaks are the small oak trees that you'll see throughout the pine barrens in some of the areas that burn more frequently. These are unusual from other oaks in that they can resprout directly from their roots. So you don't need to have any part of the plant still surviving above the soil in order for this to come back very quickly after a fire. Similarly, we have the heath plants that will grow through rhizomes. Now, the plant will be entirely safe in its rhizome under the surface of the soil there. So after a fire, the entire top part of the plant can burn away, and the heath plants, the blueberries and huckleberries, that we all love so much when they're fruiting, they will grow back even healthier after a fire. The fire helps to get rid of any parasites, any fungus, anything that could have been plaguing the plants before the fire. And these are some images recently after forest fires of the pitch pine trees regrowing from the roots. And we already talked about the pygmy pines, the dwarf pines, but these are some images of them. All right, any questions about plant adaptations? How are we doing on time? All right, we will go through animals rather quickly. So in the pine barrens, we do have migratory birds that will come through. There's approximately 144 species that are found within the pine barrens on a longer term basis, at least part of the year that will be spent there, as opposed to many others that will pass through on their migratory routes. Some of the more prominent ones that you'll see are the pine warblers. You'll hear prairie warblers. Cooper's hawks are always interesting to both hear and see. Strangely, there is a relatively low diversity in the pine barrens. Because there's a limited number of types of plants that can live in the pines, the vegetation diversity is relatively low, especially in those drier upland forests. So the birds will typically hang out a little bit more frequently on the edges of the pine barrens, where there's going to be more diversity in nesting habitats, where they can get different types of nesting materials. They'll prefer to be in those areas, but there are still many species that stay in the pines. We have a wide diversity of mammals in the pine barrens. The greatest number of mammal species in an ecoregion in the state is in the Pine Barrens. So we have coyotes, we have beavers. We have about 34 to 37 species that can be found here in the Pine Barrens. We have the occasional rather lost bear that will end up in the Pine Barrens, 2 different kinds of squirrels. There's no shortage of things to see. Now, because of the acidity of the water, we have very low biodiversity in fishes. We have the numbers debated between 13 to 16 species of fish that can be found here that can survive and reproduce in the Pine Barrens. And the reproduction part is the most crucial bit. There are many freshwater species that you may occasionally see in the pines, bass, for example. But because of the acidity of the water, bass are not supposed to be able to reproduce in the Pine Barrens. There are many lakes near towns that will be stocked with bass and perch, but you won't typically find them to reproduce or have multi-generational bass. And if you do see that, it's a sign that there's something wrong with that water system. It's no longer as acidic as it should be, or there's something else going on that is making this no longer Pine Barrens water. Of these 13 to 16 fish species that are found in the Pine Barrens, 6 of them are only found in the Pine Barrens. We primarily have, there's pickerel, like that photo on the left there, and then we have several different kinds of sunfish, are the most common ones we'll see. Amphibians are also limited by the acidic water that we have here, but we do have quite a few species of amphibians. In fact, the New Jersey Pine Barrens is the global stronghold for the Pine Barrens tree frog. Most of these species rely on vernal pools for breeding, pools that will be wet and swampy part of the year, and then will dry up and go away for other parts of the year. Many of the amphibians, the salamanders especially, will lay eggs in those vernal pools. Now, when we do have changes in the pH of the water, the amphibians are the first ones that are susceptible to this. They're also the most susceptible to some of the invasive species coming in and outcompeting them if that pH changes. Now, for the birds that we lack in the Pine Barrens, we more than make up for it with reptile species. We have, you can see the breakdown there, 12 different kinds of turtles, 3 different kinds of lizards, 18 different kinds of snakes, only one of which is venomous, so don't worry. The timber rattler is venomous, but it's very, very shy. We also are one of the strongholds of the endangered northern pine snake. It's one of the largest snakes in the entirety of North America. We're also a home of the eastern hognose snake. And we also are a holdout for arthropods. It's, as in many places, the largest and most diverse group of fauna within the Pine Barrens. Over 10,000 species have been discovered so far. This acidic water and the low calcium levels of our soil means that we don't have quite as many mosquitoes or earthworms, but we do have lots of the damselflies, lots and lots of dragonflies. You can see many, many different types of arthropods. So before we move on to our next section, any question about animals? So the final thing that I want to get to tonight are the threats to the Pine Barrens. So as with many places in New Jersey and in the country, development is one of the biggest issues we face. This leads to increased fragmentation in the Pine Barrens. Poor management can be a problem, and climate change is changing the way that the Pine Barrens look and the species that are able to live here. Finally, invasive species are unfortunately getting a stronghold in many areas in the pines. So So when development starts making its way through, you can see the drastic change that habitat loss can have on a species. When only 20% of the habitat is destroyed, we're already down to about 60% of the species remaining. So it is a very, very steep slope. When habitat goes away, the species go away at a much greater rate. And unfortunately, in the pines, habitat loss is one of the biggest problems. Off-road vehicle usage is something that is a constant struggle and one of the biggest issues that we face. It's also one of the hardest issues to crack down on. If one truck is driving through the pines and decides to drive through an area that they maybe shouldn't go through, they can destroy a habitat for generations of an animal to come. And if there isn't a park police member right there at the right time to stop that person from doing it, it's difficult to get people to understand why this is a problem and why they shouldn't drive wherever they want. The wetlands are even more vulnerable. It's a problem when that happens with uplands, but with the wetlands, especially with these vernal pools like this one is, that can destroy an entire year's worth of eggs for a salamander or a frog. And that's going to limit the population. It's going to really bottleneck it for that year and can be an even bigger problem than it may seem with just, I drove through a puddle, not the end of the world. Well, for that species, it might be the end of the world. Development also drastically changes the water use. Just anecdotally, we are seeing problems with our paddling trips. With the increased water usage over the past several years, there are several trips that we haven't been able to run as frequently as we had in the past, simply because there isn't enough water in the river for that trip. So as more houses and more agricultural operations, more warehouses tap into that Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer to use water, it makes it more and more difficult for the water level in the aquifer to stay at a usable level to recreate in and for the species that rely on the water to be there reliably. And this just shows the groundwater pumpage in millions of gallons per year in the Kirkwood-Cohansey aquifer system. This map is from 2009. I haven't been able to find an updated map, but I can be sure that many of those blue dots that are the 100 to 500 million gallons per year range have moved on to the red dot range of being a 500 to 3,500 million gallons per year range. And one of the other big problems with development is the pollution. Not only the dumping and the physical pollution that we hear about, but chemical pollution is an even bigger problem, especially when agricultural operations will add lime or other alkalizing agents to make the soil less acidic, so it's more possible for them to grow their crops. That makes its way, again, into the aquifer, makes the soil less acidic in those green areas, leads to that bass being able to reproduce, or a bullfrog being able to move in and outcompete the native tree frogs or leopard frogs or something else that's naturally found here. I am running over, so I am going to stop here. Many of the other threats that are facing the Pine Barrens are directly related to development. So by covering this, we can just extrapolate and see many of the other issues that are being faced by the Pine Barrens. And many of these issues are ones that the Pinelands Preservation Alliance is working to counteract. They work with and look at the Pinelands Commission to see what's going on in the Pine Barrens and try to make sure that they advocate for those green spaces remaining as green as possible. Does anybody have questions about anything I've talked about?
What are the invasive species that are currently threatening the area?
The bass grass are one of the biggest problems, being stocked in certain areas, and they make their way to other areas that may have their pH raised by some of that pollution that I talked about, and can reproduce, and then they will outcompete the native sunfish and other native species. Bullfrogs are also one of the biggest issues. They have a similar relationship with the native amphibians. Also, smartweed is something that's a big problem as well. If you go to Goshen Pond, it's a relatively remote area in Morton State Forest. There's a campground nearby, but it's an area that has been pretty well protected for a long time. The plants are almost entirely choked out by smartweed. So the arrow arum that you would see for most of the summer, now you just see smartweed along there. And there's several others that you'll see in different areas, but those three are the ones that have been some of the biggest problems.
Are there lanternflies in there?
We have seen lanternflies, but they haven't been as big of a problem as they have been in other areas. And I hope that stays that way. Any other questions?
How's climate change affecting the pinelands?
Climate change, the biggest issue that it's causing is as the temperatures change, it affects the range of the native plants and animals that are found in the Pine Barrens. So the New Jersey Pine Barrens are a unique area. It is the only spot on Earth where certain plants and animals intersect. We're the northernmost bit of the range for several southern species. The southern tway-blade orchid, southern leopard frog, other species like that were the northernmost part of their range. On the other end of things, we're the southernmost end of the range for several northern species. Broom crowberry, reindeer lichen, and some of those other tundra plants that were left behind by the glaciation. This is the only spot where those species overlap in that way. So as climate change continues, the world warms up, those ranges change. Those southern species are creeping up further north, but so are the northern species. So if the range changes enough that the southernmost part of the range for the northern species kind of falls off the top of the Pine Barrens, remember the next chunk of Pine Barrens isn't until we get to Long Island. So the southern species will take a very long time to jump up there if they ever do make it. So that's one of the biggest concerns with climate change. Also, as sea levels rise, the salt water is coming further and further inland. And one of the most important Pine Barrens plants, the Atlantic white cedars, they are very salt intolerant. So as that salt water makes it further upstream, we're seeing more of what we call ghost forests, groves of cedar trees that are still standing, but they're dead, mostly because of saltwater intrusion.
So do I remember that this area was called an international biosphere, and is that still covered?
A UNESCO biosphere ecoregion is, I think, the official term, but yes, it is still considered that.
And then the Pinelands Commissions all have to look for some guidelines to help them manage. Is that?
I'm not sure how that plays into the Pinelands Commission. Because the Pinelands Commission is more focused on land usage and preserving the Pinelands National Reserve, like the political designation of this map, as opposed to the biological designation that comes from the UNESCO thing. So I don't believe that there, but I'm not sure.
We still have that.
We do, yes.
Respect.
Is there one towards the back?
Yeah, do you foresee the recent legal challenges to the vernal pools not being considered as wetlands as a major problem coming up, or do you think you have enough protection already there?
It's certainly a concern. We are very lucky here in New Jersey that our state legislation is at a higher level of protection than the federal protection was. So even though that court case that happened changed the designation for many other places in New Jersey, we had very few, not very many changes at all. So As long as our legislation stays the way that it is, our wetlands should be okay.
How will turbines affect the pinelands?
We don't expect any effect at all.
It's ridiculous.
Can you explain what UNESCO is real quick? Do you know about that?
I don't know enough to be able to speak fluently on it.
What governing authority is that, or what?
You know, I'm sorry, I have to look it up to be sure. I don't want to say the wrong thing, so. Yeah, it's a part of the United Nations, but yeah.
Are the pinelands in Long Island and Cape Cod, are they protected in the same way as the New Jersey pinelands?
They have their own sets of protections, but they are not the same as the New Jersey Pinelands. The biggest difference is because the New Jersey Pinelands is such a large area and includes those areas that people are living in, and the sections in Cape Cod and Long Island had already been shrunk into individual forests by the time people thought about protecting them. It's not the same.
Is it more easily protected?
Pretty much, more as like, this is a green space, don't live there, kind of thing.
Who is the final governing authority over this area? Is it UNESCO or is it New Jersey?
It's New Jersey. So there's the New Jersey Pinelands Commission, where the members of that commission are appointed by the governor. And they really have the final say on what can and can't happen within the Pine Barrens. But the individual municipalities have a lot of say as well.